Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you guys with the most up-to-date political, economic and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday everybody. In the previous 2 videos we discussed at length the national protests from over the weekend and into this week. For today's video, let's return to one of the primary causes of the frustration, the outbreak and lockdown situation across the country, and specifically implementation of Beijing's zero-COVID policy, before moving on to the political fallout from the protests themselves. Today's video will primarily be discussing these themes, as this is currently the most important news coming out of China. Tomorrow we will return to regular videos with multiple topics. On this occasion I have to film in a different location, so there is a little bit of an echo. My apologies for the suboptimal audio quality. Related, provide a reason for their refusal. The time between the second shot and the booster shot will also be shortened from 6 months to 3 months. Officially recognized daily cases continue to sit at approximately 40,000, with dozens of cities currently implementing varying degrees of lockdowns, including the sensitive capital itself. One analyst pointed out that state-run The Beijing News published a long story which interviews people who have had COVID and have now recovered, and that this, quote, could be part of the necessary shift in propaganda work to lead people to be less scared of getting COVID, end quote. Perhaps, but we will need to see a more widespread shift in state-run media coverage to make this sort of call. Not all signs are optimistic for opening up, however. For example, in a report that caused a stir online, Chinese financial media outlet Caijing claims that the province of Shandong, eastern China, has earmarked over 23 billion RMB to build 119 temporary hospitals with over 200,000 beds. The costs. Yesterday, Central State-run People's Daily ran a long article about Shenzhen Nuclearis Gene Technology, a firm which has set up at least 37 testing labs across the country, providing more than 700 million tests in 45 cities since February of 2020. The piece expresses that the company's, quote, testing irregularities, end quote, has, quote, aroused widespread public doubts, end quote, and called for greater regulation of the company and other testing firms. The state-run Global Times yesterday writes that in southwest China's Chongqing municipality, the city authorities have established 5 special working groups to conduct an investigation over 16 third-party COVID testing institutions to regulate the tests, quote, as the city has reported more than 80,000 positive cases in the latest round of flare-ups, end quote. Meanwhile, as we discussed yesterday, more investors and analysts are now betting that popular discontent will push Beijing to accelerate the pace at which it phases out zero COVID. Quote, within this week, or at the most by the end of next week, we think that we'll see top decision makers coming out and talking about how and why China should relax COVID controls, end quote. Other analysts and commentators warn that the global economy should be ready for China's opening up too. Quote, we should be very concerned for the people of China, but this situation also has global implications. If the floodgates open, there will be an impact on the economy. We've seen throughout the pandemic that healthy people equals a healthy economy. A massive outbreak in China would have a global cascading impact on supply chains. It could also impact viral evolution. If COVID-19 takes hold in China, there will be little to stop the virus from jumping person to person in a network of 1.4 billion people, about 20% of the global population. Some mutations arise from persistent infection with immunocompromised people. We think this is how Omicron developed. But the more a virus jumps, the more opportunity it has to randomly mutate. This is how we got Delta, for example, end quote. UK-based The Economist writes this week that, quote, there is also potential for an even more disorderly 2023 in which cases run wild and authorities are forced to abandon zero COVID, end quote, warning that the, quote, rosy outlook of many China watchers enticed by the prospects of the end of the policy, end quote, fails to account for, quote, what could become one of the world's largest public health upheavals in recent memory, a vast resurgence in cases across a population almost entirely new to the virus, end quote. Next up, how are the current protests developing? Hey guys, if you like what I'm trying to do here with China Update and you can go that extra mile to support the channel, Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee links are in the description below. This is the best way to help me continue keeping this channel sustainable. If you're enjoying this episode in particular, don't forget to hit that like button. If you haven't subscribed, maybe consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much everybody for the ongoing support. Now while we're here, let's quickly update the protest situation. Yesterday, Tuesday, was relatively quiet on the protest front. As we discussed in yesterday's video, the security apparatus across the country has prepared for years for this kind of contingency, and it moved very quickly on Sunday and Monday to put out small fires before they could grow. Security officials are already tracking down the people who participated in protests on the street. Because of the COVID health code system installed on cell phones, which is required to go anywhere outside your home, protest participants should be relatively easy to find. Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei, no stranger to protests in China, expressed to international media on Monday that he doesn't see this protest movement going anywhere, due primarily to lack of leadership and cohesion, saying, quote, "There's no clear political agenda, so it's very easy to just arrest them and move on." End quote. Beijing's Tsinghua University and other schools in the capital and in the southern province of Guangdong have confirmed that they have sent students home, many to far-flung towns and cities across the country, in the hopes that they will, quote, "cool off," end quote. As we discussed yesterday, Beijing is particularly wary of demonstrations at top universities due to the legacy of student-led movements in modern Chinese history, most notably the May 4th movement and of course Tiananmen Square in 1989. Meanwhile, in the United States, the New York Times writes that the White House is divided on how exactly to respond to the recent China demonstrations. Quote, "Administration officials said that the situations were not comparable to the protests in Iran, and that they had doubts that the protests that played out on the streets of Beijing and Shanghai over the weekend would be sustained, or that the calls for an end to COVID restrictions amounted to a fundamental call for government change." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much everybody for watching. We should be back to regular episodes in the next video. I will see you all tomorrow.